Hey, isn't it crazy that Gen Z is struggling more financially than older generations? Wait, no, it wasn't Gen Z, it was Millennials. Millennials are still struggling financially, especially when compared to past generations. Wait, that can't be right either, because don't people say that Gen X have trouble leaving home, finding careers, and many feel unprepared to begin retirement? Why does it feel like every newer generation is doing worse financially than the last one? To find out, let's start by taking a look at...
Stay away from that old Bible man. Don't you take that fruit he's holding in his hand.
Imagine this. It's the 1950s. Average price for groceries were $18 a week. You did not need to take a second mortgage for a gallon of gas. And buying a house in the future was realistic. That's great and all, but that also comes with the context of coming out of a war and the literal worst economic depression the world has seen at the time. By being born in this time period, you, yes, you, a member of the silent generation, were raised with the mindset of scarcity and uncertainty when it comes to money. Your dad probably went off to war or worked in a factory. Your mom probably worked some pink-collar job, and as a child, you were probably forced to ration food. Any money that did come in had to be saved for something important later. There was no such thing as frivolous spending. Point is, majority of your life, you never had enough. Until you did. Now in your adult years, during the 50s, you experienced one of the best economic booms the world has seen at the time. Factories that used to make weapons and tools of war now switched to making consumer goods, making them more abundant. Country infrastructure has expanded, and jobs galore. Your car? Cheap. House? Cheap. Kitchen appliances? Cheap. Medical expenses? Well, get rid of that cigarette addiction and then we'll talk, Larry. But for the most part, you were not foolish with your money, because thanks to your childhood, you know what it's like to not have as much. You became risk averse and cautious with your money, prioritizing saving and being loyal to the one job you have, because you don't know if you'll ever get another one. Your perspective shifts from we don't have enough to we must protect what we have. But what happens when you have kids that never experienced such a hardship? Baby boomers have been the target of a lot of the blame for the financial state of today's society as of late. Now you, yes, you, a valued member of the baby boomer generation, grew up in a very interesting time. Your dad makes a modest wage working as a factory worker. When adjusted for inflation in today's dollars, he's making roughly $40,000 a year. Your mom works a respectable career as a store clerk in the neighborhood grocery store. Wait a minute. No, she didn't. She was actually at home, cooking and taking care of you and your siblings. Why? Because your factory worker dad had enough purchasing power from his salary to provide income for an entire household. How nice. And it's not like he was skimpy with his expenses either. Your family still could afford their house, car, vacations, and even had some left over for savings. And lucky for you, your childhood was a doozy, suffering from the success of post-war prosperity. If your dad participated in the war, your family benefits from the GI Bill, which gave your parents low-interest home loans and gave you access to affordable college. Speaking of homes, during the 50s, a new house only cost about 2 times the average annual income. And as you became an adult during the 70s, your parents' home would have appreciated enough value where if they passed it down to you, you would have a massive head start in the wealth building game. Even if you didn't inherit your parents' house, if you wanted to buy a house in the early 70s, a new home would still only cost 2 to 3 times the average household income. And banks weren't skimpy with handing out decent mortgages either. Debt? What is debt to a baby boomer? You probably finished college with little to no debt to your name, as public universities often only cost a few $100s a year to attend, meaning you likely entered the workforce with a clean slate, giving you the opportunity to start saving sooner rather than later. Fresh out of college, you likely begun a career as a white-collar office worker. You earn an average yearly income of $9,870, which would be the equivalent purchasing power of about $78,000 today, which, surprise, surprise, just like your parents, was still enough to comfortably support a family on a single income in most cases. In the late 60s to early 70s, the job market was considered to be the best historically, with record low unemployment rates and wages that saw rapid growth and often grew proportionally with the cost of living. So as a boomer, most of your early adulthood was marked with affordable basic living expenses. And also, let's not forget that baby boomers are called that for a reason. They were the largest living generation at the time and kept that title all the way until 2019. So as the voting majority, a lot of politics at the time were catered to what the boomers wanted and needed. AKA politicians were forced to center their campaigns on major boomer needs like education funding and tax cuts for middle class. Their massive size did work against them eventually in the mid to late 70s though. Stagflation hit, and as more adults entered the workforce, it made getting a decent job more competitive. Despite this though, a lot of boomers still worked under the guise and confidence that they'll be able to retire with full social security benefits and pension planning. And healthcare costs at the time were still low comparative to income. I'll be honest with you guys, being born as a baby boomer was like living life on recruit difficulty. It's like you had to go out of your own way to screw yourself up. But what happens when a baby boomer has a kid during a time when these favorable conditions start to run dry? Generation X, the generation that everyone seems to forget about for some reason. Don't worry, Gen Xers, I got y'all. But they're also the first generation to experience the economic decline after the collapse of the post-World War II boom that the silent generation and baby boomers had the privilege of experiencing. Here you are, yes you, the person watching this video, a member of Gen X, experiencing a childhood different from both the silent generation and the baby boomer. Growing up post-early 70s, you probably saw your parents struggle a little bit. Your dad, if he did not have a job at the time, was probably at home more times than the other kids' dads were. Why? Stagflation. During the mid-70s, families faced high inflation costs and high unemployment, particularly in the United States. The 1973 oil crisis and the 1979 oil shock doubled the price of gasoline and fuel across the globe, which of course affects the cost of things that rely on fuel, aka literally everything. So as a family, your parents saw a higher cost for transportation, food, and all other goods that were way cheaper to purchase when they, early baby boomers, were coming of age. You probably saw your household affected so badly you were the first generation to grow up in a time where a two-income household was a normal standard. Yup, both mom and dad had to work to maintain a middle-class lifestyle. The problem is exacerbated even more so when you realize a lot of baby boomers were able to inherit some wealth and assets from their parents, paid off houses, pensions, savings, businesses, stocks, bonds, etc. But it looks like Gen X would be the first post-World War II generation where a financial inheritance from parents will be rare. But that's okay. It shouldn't be all bad because it's the 80s. And as you begin to make your mark as a brand new adult, it's time for you to start looking at college. Now, let's see how much we need to save for your education. Oh. What? Sorry to break the news to you, but your generation of adults will be the first to face what will be known in the future as the student debt crisis in America. As tuition skyrockets, more and more young adults will have to rely on student loans in order to afford higher education, increasing the likelihood that you, as a Gen X, will leave college in debt. You might be thinking to yourself, how did this happen? How did tuition get so high all of a sudden? Well, a few things. The government at the time decided to cut state and federal funding for education. In the past, there would be grants and federal aid given to students to help fill the gap for the cost of tuition. But politicians at the time did not believe in the idea of government taking financial responsibility for the education of their citizens. You gotta handle that yourself now, which is crazy to think about considering they had no issue doing that for decades. But ain't it mighty convenient that these policy changes were decided after the baby boomer generation were rising in political power and majority of them were already beyond college age? I'm sure it's a coincidence. Unfortunately, it seems the prior two generations decided it was easier to cut higher education for younger students to fight inflation and budget deficits than to simply raise taxes for the older, wealthier generation who could have afforded it. And then they turn to you, Gen X, and say it's because they believe higher education should be an investment, not a right, and that if you took a loan, you might take college more seriously. But then that argument immediately loses steam when you realize the people making these policies did not have to go through that themselves. But you know what? I digress. Anyways, it's the 90s, and you just graduated college. Unfortunately, you did need to take out student loans to attend, and the average debt you accumulated post-grad was around $9,300, roughly $19,000 in today's money. As an adult entering the workforce, you now work in automotive mechanics, making an average salary of $30,000 a year, which is about $74,000 today, which, all things considered, is a great income. until you realize boomers had more purchasing power on less dollars. So although you technically have a greater net income than the last generation, it didn't go as far as it used to. Groceries are getting a bit more expensive. Gas seems to be alright though, at least in the late 90s. Healthcare? Costs were beginning to rise faster than wages could keep up with. But housing? When baby boomers were adults in the 70s and 80s, houses were typically only 2 to 3 times an average salary. Buying a home was still possible even in your 20s and 30s. When Gen X became adults in the 90s to 2000s, houses were about 3 to 4 times the average salary. And we have to remember, Gen Xers were 21 to 36 when the 2001 dot-com bust happened, and 28 to 43 years old by the time the 2008 housing crash occurred. Pretty much the exact age range someone would be considering buying a home. So unfortunately, a lot of Gen Xers either had to delay purchasing a house for far later in life than boomers had to, or gave up the idea in general. But hey, give them some slack. They literally went through 2 recessions since becoming an adult. But surely it can't get any worse from here. Millennials. Oh, millennials, what ails thee this time? Imagine this. It's the 80s and 90s, and you, yes, the person watching this on their Samsung 77-inch 4K OLED television screen. A millennial. As a kid, you're probably having the time of your life. Your dad, most likely a baby boomer, is off to work. Times have changed. Post mid-1970s recession, it was up in the air as to whether or not you saw your mom go to work as well. But as society began to get more expensive, that became more of a reality. But good news for your parents, there was a tech boom in the 90s. So if they happened to be in a tech field or tech adjacent, they likely saw their average wage double. Up until 2001, of course, where it all went down the drain. But anyways, you just graduated high school and now you're off to college. You do a degree of some kind. Well, hope you had a fun 4 years, because during the late 2000s and 2010s, you accumulated anywhere from $23,000 to $30,000 of student loan debt for your bachelor's degree. Literally double the debt of Gen X around the same age. But that's okay, because now you are entering the workforce as a brand new adult in a post-2008 recession world. It's the early 2010s. You are anywhere from 25 to 34 years old, making an average salary of $42,000 a year, which is the equivalent purchasing power of about $57,000 today. And as you can see, if you compare yourself to the generation prior, you technically earn more income dollar to dollar per year, but your purchasing ability per dollar has gone down significantly, which means it never actually feels like you have more money. This also could be because of timing. Like we spoke about, millennials started entering the workforce right after a recession. So as you can imagine, the job market was all but non-existent. You probably had to settle for a lower paying job in the beginning of your career, leaving you with a poor head start in terms of saving compared to other generations. It also doesn't help that the average wage for young adults, when adjusted for inflation, hasn't really improved much at all from the 1980s to the early 2010s. At this point, you might think this might be an easy explanation as to why millennials are worse off financially than the last 3 generations. Oh, they just inherited a bad economy. They graduated when student debt was at an all-time high. They were too young to benefit off the economy rebound. All of which are true, obviously, but let's not forget that there are legitimate policies placed over the course of decades that made it more difficult for future generations to succeed financially. We already know about the cuts to higher education that are raising tuition costs, but when it comes to housing, there was a failure of policymakers to ease the housing affordability crisis. They've made it difficult for builders to build new homes that would drive down the price of housing across the board. Federal support for affordable housing in the 2010s has not kept up with population growth, meaning as a millennial, you're facing historically high cost to income ratios compared to previous generations. Literally 4 to 5 times the average millennial household salary compared to 3 to 4 times for Gen X and 2 to 3 times for baby boomers. It really does seem like millennials have the short end of the stick here, but we still have one generation whose stick might get a bit shorter as time goes on. Imagine this. It's the 2020s. Average price of groceries is $300 a week. It is what it is for gas at this point. And would you like to buy a house? Keep dreaming. You might remember what it was like growing up in the 2000s and 2010s, because you, and I mean this unironically looking at my average viewer demographic, you, a Gen Z, have been dealt an interesting set of cards when it comes to the opportunity for financial success. You were too young for the two major recessions that occurred in the 2000s to affect you in specific in any way. You might have memories of your Gen X parents struggling during the '08 crisis, potentially a major job loss, or a period of time where mom and dad couldn't buy you the things that you wanted. You almost definitely saw both of your parents at work growing up, as a two-income household was considered common at this point. But hey, that's the past now, because as a Gen Z adult in the late 2010s to early 2020s, you're off to a 4-year college.
A growing number of schools across the tri-state area continue to either cancel classes or move to remote learning.
All of it to ensure everyone's safety during the coronavirus outbreak.
Oh, sorry, I meant 1.5 years in college and 2.5 in Zoom University. The pandemic marked a key change in Gen Z adulthood versus when all prior generations were coming of age. For starters, even before the pandemic, tuition prices were still on a stratospheric rise even when compared to millennials. Out of college, you accumulated anywhere from $35,000 to $40,000 worth of student loan debt for a 4-year bachelor's degree. As a Gen Z, you entered the workforce during or post a COVID economy, where job markets were unstable, massive layoffs, and unemployment were becoming normal, and job automation with AI replacing human roles began to become a reality. If you happened to find a job, you earn an average yearly salary of $55,000 a year, which is a decent salary for a single Gen Zer supporting themselves financially. Dollar for dollar, Gen Z actually has the highest salary as a coming-of-age adult versus previous generations around the same age range. However, as we've seen the pattern before, when comparing purchasing power of all the generations at the peak of their economy, Gen Z has the worst bang for their buck, effectively as of now making them the poorest generation in comparison. There are other factors that contribute to the feeling that your money is not stretching as far. The Gen Z average wage is okay if you're supporting yourself financially. Oh, actually no, I meant only if you're supporting yourself financially. But even then, depending on where you live, you might feel like you're barely getting above water. Food and grocery prices from 2019 to 2025 have surged almost 30% in price. If you rent an apartment in a major city in the United States, from 2017 to 2024, rent prices has surged 49%. If you live in an area that requires a car, which is pretty much everywhere outside of New York, car prices of newer models have increased anywhere from 25% to 35% from a pre-pandemic 2019. And the most unfortunate part of all, wages across the board, but particularly for Gen Z, have not increased proportionally to the basic cost of living and are not keeping up with the cost of inflation. Gen Z has a less favorable opportunity to build wealth in comparison to previous generations, as so much of their income has to go to rent, debt, rising healthcare costs, and living expenses. Meaning, without significant policy change in action, Gen Z will continue to spiral downward financially at an unprecedented rate, unlike any generation has seen before. The American dream of a white picket fence, one income household with a dog, car, and 2.5 kids seems all but out of reach for Gen Z adults, especially as housing costs and mortgages increase to about 5 to 6 times the average salary compared to only 2 to 3 times in the 1950s. Honestly, and I know this goes without saying, but it does suck that this is the reality for this generation. There are kids genuinely struggling to make a name for themselves and even do the bare minimum, like find a job, and yet we have one side of the aisle saying it's because Gen Z is lazy and has a work ethic issue, which is blatantly untrue, by the way. It's also crazy to think that a large part of how much of a head start you have in your financial future depends on what generation you happen to be born in as well, which actually makes me think, and hold up guys, let me explain myself. Is it more accurate to say that baby boomers happen to be super lucky being born after a war when the economy peaked? They didn't care to sustain it after they became adults and ruined it for every generation after? Or was every generation destined to be financially worse off than the last regardless of context, and boomers happen to be given a good set of cards, so to speak? I know the future seems grim, especially for Gen Alpha coming up, as chances are they're not gonna fare much better either. And I'm not usually the type of person to throw in a random happy ending in the for a video just for the sake of having one, but I do believe in finding the silver lining. I mean, surely it can't all be doom and gloom. For example, actually hold up, let me look this up real quick. Oh, apparently Gen Z is investing more than any other generation? Hey, that sounds pretty good to me. Side hustle culture for Gen Z goes crazy, albeit out of necessity, and most likely if their normal careers paid enough, they wouldn't have to do this now, but you know. And there's no guarantee that the economy will continue to get worse indefinitely. Maybe as the older generations begin to pass along and Gen Z becomes the dominant generation for political power, maybe things will get better? Or at least I hope so. If not, Gen Beta will start making YouTube videos about how Gen Z ruined their future. And that's gonna suck.